Thank you, Chair, and thank you to your guests. I'm going to be very brief because I'm aware it's been a long session, and unfortunately I don't be talking to constituents at 12:45 at night. They're usually in bed because they have to be up early the next morning for haulage or farming or whatever it is. But anyway, moving swiftly on from that, Deputy Canny and Deputy Boyd Barrett both spoke around infrastructure, as you did yourselves, and they both mentioned water. And water is a constraint in my area, particularly in South Kildare, because what's happening is we have new houses being built and then they can't get the water supply in. So the people that are depending on them houses are still living in rented accommodation at a huge expense because the rent is exorbitant over there. So I find that needs to be addressed. And somebody did say we can't leave it till 2040, and I totally agree we can't. So I would like to see some sort of an input there. And then Deputy Durkin also spoke around retrofitting, and I do feel in many areas that local authorities are wasting money around the retrofitting, because what they are doing is perhaps maybe putting in air to water in their own, their own stock, and not replacing windows and doors, and you're effectively heating outside rather than inside. So there's a huge problem around that. So I think we need to be more careful around how money is spent around infrastructure and around houses that we're going to build in the future, and make sure that the money is correctly spent. The other thing I wanted to ask some of the guests was, could they elaborate on the continued use of once-off payments? And I got the feeling that you weren't in favour of these, and that the standards of living weren't really going up by them. So I'm asking, could I get a little bit of elaboration around that? And then I suppose the other thing, I will go consecutively with the questions if that's okay, because of time restraint. IFAC made several terms we're being left out of the government's forecast, such as climate transition costs. Can I get a little bit elaboration around that? And I suppose the elephant in the room for me is, do we have any thoughts on what we can do with the gains from the Apple tax? Thank you.
Fairly concise, and we'll let it yours.
I might kick off on the one-off payments, if that's okay. So thanks, Deputy Ryan, for the comments. So we actually did a post-budget analysis last year where we looked at the effect of all of the measures in the budget, the tax and welfare measures, direct and indirect, on household incomes. And we split out the permanent from the temporary measures, because we felt that, if you're thinking about the long-term evolution of the tax and welfare system, it's really the permanent measures you want to be looking at, in terms of long-term forecasting. The temporary measures, of course, in the early stages of the cost of living crisis, there was a really good case for them because we had no idea how high inflation was going to go. We would have argued last year and even the year before that the case for one-off payments was becoming much less clear, and that instead policymakers should be focusing on permanent changes, because inflation was not going away. It was coming down, but the cost of living was still quite high. So when we looked at the effect of permanent versus temporary measures last year, if you take the 4 budgets between 2020 and 2024 and you exclude the temporary payments, low-income households and middle-income households were on average worse off compared to a budget that would have kept their real incomes constant, right? That would have evolved in line with income growth. Whereas high income households were not, because there were lots of above inflation increases to tax credits and bans and things like that. So the issue arises when we get rid of the temporary payments. What happens? Do we have some sort of compensation mechanism or a catch-up mechanism for low and middle income households to restore their standard of living? And there's no real clear indication that that's going to happen. It seems like there'd be more one-off payments this year. But really, I suppose what we'd like to see is a plan for maybe benchmarking social welfare payments to something that appears reasonable and is linked to standard of living, and then looking at either indexing them from there based on price growth, or at least comparing what policymakers are actually going to do to an index benchmark, so we see where the real gains and losses are.
Thank you very much.
I might just come in on the climate side then. So there's 2 big things I suppose you can think of. One is the loss of all these taxes that we need to replace. So basically you lose a load of revenues coming in through motor tax, through fossil fuel revenues, and the likes of those. Now you could just do distance travel taxes, you could have congestion charges, and the tax strategy papers look at some of those solutions, and they've been looked at elsewhere. Those are really just taxes you're going to have to figure out a way to replace. But in terms of the spending, which is I think what you're kind of talking about more, there's probably 3 big areas you can think of there. One is the massive amounts of retrofitting, which you referred to, which is really labour intensive, and we know it's going to take a very long time, and it's going to be expensive if we try and do it all now. given there's such a shortage of workers in those areas, and we're looking for the same types of workers to do housing, to do transport, to do infrastructure. So that's really difficult. Another area, though, is the switch to the electrification of Ireland's vehicles, right? So it can be anything from public sector vehicles like ambulances, like Garda vehicles, to private transport. And basically that's people switching from a fossil fuel vehicle, internal combustion engine, to an electric vehicle. And we know that that's going to be difficult for people to do. But the good thing about it is that it's mostly imported, right? So it's not going to add to domestic pressures in terms of price pressures. And that's a good sign that we can actually do it at a time like this in the cycle without adding to the existing pressures. So that's one way we could use a lot of this money to hit targets that are going to be binding anyway. And we know actually from some more research done on the costs of non-compliance that those costs are looking exceptionally large for Ireland. So there's a recent report from T&E which looked at the costs across Europe, and Ireland is bottom of the league table in terms of the failure to meet its targets and how far it could be out. And it looks like it's going to find it really difficult in 2032 to buy compliance from other member states that are overperforming, because the likes of Germany and Italy are so far behind as well that they'll probably buy up most of these credits from other member states. That leaves us in a really difficult position, and we could be looking at non-compliance costs of way over 10 billion, potentially even up to 20 billion in some of the scenarios, and that really dwarfs the Apple money. And when we talk about these things, we need to think about the cost of these sanctions coming down the line, and they're just a payment out to our neighbours in terms of, you know, if you think of that as a lost opportunity of the things we could be doing to benefit Irish citizens, that's a really stark trade-off.
Shocking. It's shocking. Thank you.